I know things. Indeed I do. Concealed things, hidden things, things we dare only whisper about in the dark. It is my job, my mission, my distinct pleasure to overturn the rocks of strangers' lives and expose the pale, ugly, wriggling secrets underneath. How do I know what I know, you may ask? Why, it is my business to know, and it is your business not to know how I know what I know. Suffice it to say that this story is undeniably, inextricably, unquestionably true. Even the parts I've made up. So, brew a cuppa, dim the lights, and situate yourselves as comfortably as can be while I present you the sordid and somewhat icky case of Avery Tibbits and his anal infestation. Please, if you must vomit, be discreet so as to not disturb the others. After watching his mother die from colorectal cancer, few things could frighten Avery Tibbits more than seeing blood in the toilet bowl. Bugs, however, were one of those things. Avery finished his business, wiped precisely 3 times using precisely 4 squares of toilet paper each time, and fastened his trousers. He glanced in the bowl, as we all do, before flushing, and rather than tapered logs that had been Salisbury steak and spinach salad the night before, what he saw was a wriggling mass of insects, or at least a close approximation of the same. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, each one a mottled pus yellow and nicotine brown in color. They were about an 1/8 inch long, segmented and worm-like in body, but with 4 spindly legs, crawling all over each other. Some clung to the toilet paper like drowning sailors, grasping at flotsam, until the tissue saturated sank and left them adrift. Others managed to make their way to the porcelain curve of the bowl, scrabbling for purchase. Avery's first reaction at the sight was to freeze in utter shock. His second reaction was to shriek rather loudly. It was a high-pitched keening sound, very much like a tea kettle on the boil, which was fortunate because that's exactly how he explained the noise when Mrs. Baumgartner accosted him about the disturbance as they passed in the hallway later that morning. When shrieking produced no useful results, and really does it ever make one wonder why people resort to it so often, he did the only other thing he could think to do. He jabbed the chrome lever on the toilet tank, sending the awful cluster of critters swirling away. Avery felt a bit faint after that and decided to fortify himself with a small glass of elderberry liqueur. He wasn't much of a drinker, maybe a glass of Chardonnay on special occasions, but only rarely. The bottle had belonged to his mother, who used it for medicinal purposes before she'd gone into hospice. There was still a bit left, and the bottle had somehow managed to come along with Avery when he'd sold the house that he'd shared with his mother and moved into the apartment he now occupied. It was still rather early, but convention be damned. It wasn't every day one found his toilet bowl invaded by insects during a poo. So, after a small glass of elderberry liqueur, a poached egg, and a bit of dry toast, Avery was feeling much better and departed for work promptly at 8. He made a mental note to speak with the super about the bugs. They must have come through a cracked pipe. It was a health and safety concern, really. He'd be sure to mention that. At 9:30, Avery felt his insides bubbling. It was still an hour before his morning break, but the thought of passing gas in front of Sheila, his cubicle mate, appalled him. It wasn't because she was somewhat young and somewhat attractive, or because Avery had somewhat of a crush on her, although all those factors did come into play. The very idea of breaking wind in front of anyone absolutely mortified Avery. It just wasn't done. His mother, even as her bowels were ravaged by the cancer, forced Avery to leave the room whenever she was about to have an intestinal indiscretion, and Avery was much the same way. He clenched, while his insides roiled, causing him a not inconsiderable amount of discomfort. Beads of sweat broke out across his forehead as he tried to sit harder on his chair. After an eternal 3 or 4 minutes, Sheila scooped up a shelf of papers and headed off to the copy machine. Once she was safely around the corner, Avery lifted a cheek and released. The odor was atrocious. "Good Lord, Avery! Is that you?" Chuck Manafort popped up behind the divider between their cubicles like a malicious gopher. He hooked his mask off his nose and made a show of sniffing the air. That reeks, man. Smells like rotten elderberries. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Avery replied, pretending to busy himself with something on his computer monitor. And put your mask back on, it's unsanitary. Constance, the office manager, materialized out of thin air. She didn't actually materialize, it just seemed that way. It was a habit that had earned her the sobriquet of Connie the Creeper. What's going on here? She demanded. Avery farted, Chuck pointed an accusing finger, and it smells absolutely horrid. Well, there's no need to yell about it, Constance scolded. It's an office, not a football stadium. People are trying to work. Then she turned to Avery, forehead creased, eyes narrowed. He could imagine the scowl of disgust under her mask. Perhaps you should take your break early, Avery, she suggested, trying to force a modicum of kindness into her tone and failing. Freshen up a bit. Avery nodded, too ashamed to speak. As he sidled past Constance, Sheila chose that exact moment to return. It wasn't me, he heard Chuck announcing to Sheila as he scurried off to the men's room. Avery did that. I'd never smelled anything so repugnant. To make matters worse, even worse, Avery felt a bit squishy down there. Perhaps there had been something of substance on that bit of breeze. If so, he'd clearly picked the wrong day to wear khakis. Of course, once he was safely ensconced in the toilet stall at the far end of the empty restroom, the presence abated and his stomach settled. His briefs and trousers were blessedly unstained, but he still felt slightly greasy between the cheeks. He counted precisely 4 squares of toilet paper and muttered a few mild curses under his breath. When the cheap paper the office stocked its restrooms failed to tear across the perforation, he inspected the paper after wiping, as had become his habit after his mother's slow and painful, undignified death. While he was always delighted when there was no trace of blood, the pus yellow and nicotine brown smear that greeted him was alarming. More so when he noticed the spindly leg at the edge of the mess still twitching. Avery wasn't sure, but he thought he might have shrieked again. Somehow, one of those insects had managed to escape the toilet bowl and had been crawling around his undies all morning. The very thought made Avery want to bathe in kerosene. He used a great deal of toilet tissue after that, not bothering to count squares or tear along the perforations. By the time he had regained his wits, his bum felt as raw as his nose did when he got the sniffles and had been blowing it all day. After a final search of his clothing to ensure there was no other hitchhikers, Avery exited the restroom. Turning the corner back into the office area, Constance materialized before him, again metaphorically speaking. Is everything all right? She asked. Yes, yeah. I thought I heard a shriek. A shriek? From the men's room, when you were in there. Perhaps someone has the kettle on in the break room, he offered. A sudden kink in his colon sent Avery to clenching again. He nearly rushed back to the restroom, but he couldn't do that in front of Constance. That would be humiliating. I don't think... Look, Constance, he interrupted. I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling well. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave early. But it's not even lunch yet. I can't stay, really. No, of course. The health and well-being of our employees is the most concern of the company. What I mean to say is that if you leave before lunch, I'll be forced to dock you a whole day's pay. I understand, Avery said, backing away. It's just that, well, if I've gotten some sort of stomach bug, well, we wouldn't want me spreading it around, would we? Absolutely not, Constance agreed, now backing away herself. You go. I'll take care of everything. Feel better. And with that, she vanished. Her disappearing skills were on par with those she used to materialize. Sheila was on the phone, and Chuck, blessed, stayed down behind his cubicle wall. Avery was able to grab his jacket without having to use any of the explanations for his earlier departure that he'd mentally rehearsed while walking back to his desk. Neither Chuck nor Sheila would ever notice that he was gone, until later that evening when they decided to share a drink after work and the subject of Avery's fart came up in the conversation. On the bus ride back to the apartment, Avery's stomach began to seethe in earnest. It felt as if a handful of salad forks were churning around inside of his lower intestines. Even worse, the pressure was building to an unbearable level. 15 minutes into the ride, he began to suspect that he would not make it back to his apartment in time. After 20 minutes, that became an established fact. Scuttling off the bus at the next stop, he had a bad moment trying to renegotiate the steps without bending his knees. Avery began to mad search for the nearest toilet. The deli on the corner didn't have a public restroom, and the coffee shop next was for customers only. Avery would have happily paid for a large decaf just to use the bathroom, but there was a line, and the woman at the front was describing in detail just how she wanted the cinnamon sprinkled on her El Grande mochaccino, and, by the way, were the chocolate shavings from locally sourced, fair trade, non-GMO cocoa beans. Nearly out of his mind with desperation, Avery grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby table and dashed out of the shop. With no other options, he ducked into an alley. The notion of pooing outside, in a trash-filled alley no less, was horrific. But it was slightly less horrific than the idea of soiling himself on a busy sidewalk. Way in the back, behind overflowing dumpsters and filth-encrusted bins, he found a spot that provided as much privacy as he was likely to get. There was a bad moment when he fumbled with his belt buckle, but Avery finally managed to drop his trousers. He squatted and released with a gush and a roar, and the relief he felt made up for the squalid surroundings. Almost. "Hey, what are you doing?" came a voice to Avery's right. "What the hell's wrong with you? People live here." Avery looked to see a derelict lying on a cardboard mat, so filthy that he blended perfectly with the mounds of rubbish. The man cradled a gallon jug of Thunderbird as if it were a baby. Avery stammered. The man's eyes grew wide. His mouth dropped open, revealing teeth so crooked and gray, they looked like tombstones after an earthquake. He pointed a shaking finger at Avery's backside. "You're shitting bugs!" he squawked. Avery looked between his knees. The ground around his feet was covered with a wriggling mass of worm-like insects, mottled pus yellow and nicotine brown in color. They had segmented bodies approximately an eighth of an inch long, with 4 spindly legs, just like the bugs he'd seen in his toilet earlier. But these had not crawled in through any cracked pipes. They were coming out of his... Avery shrieked. He was getting quite good at that. The derelict dropped his bottle. It rolled towards Avery. The man lunged to grab it, jealous of the few swallows of cheap wine that remained inside. It was a fatal mistake. They got the attention of the insects. They turned as one, surging towards him. The vagrant turned to scramble away, but only managed to trap himself in a corner between a rubbish bin and the filth-speckled and graffitied brick wall. Bugs flowed over him, up his trouser legs, under the hem of his coat, down his shirt collar. He opened his mouth to scream, but they swarmed across his gravestone teeth and into his throat, choking off any sound that he made. They must have had teeth, Avery realized, along with those segmented bodies and spindly legs, because he saw little beads of blood rise from the man's grubby skin, pooling together and running in rivets. Avery was not sure how long he squatted there, pants around his ankles, mouth agape, a string of drool hanging from his lower lip. He watched as the derelict disappeared, devoured from the inside out, deflating like a skin balloon. In the end, there was nothing left but his tattered clothes. Even the bones had been consumed. Avery shrieked once more, just for good measure, before he yanked up his trousers and fled. "It was just the kettle," he repeated over and over as he ran, still holding up his unfastened trousers. No one paid him much mind. It was the city, after all. People were mostly immune to such weirdness. Despite having always ridden the bus to work, Avery somehow managed to find his way to his building. Taking the stairs 2 at a time to his 3rd-floor apartment, patent Oxfords sleeping loudly on the worn wooden steps, he ducked inside just as Mrs. Baumgartner stuck her head into the hall to see who was raising such a ruckus. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and sweat streamed down his body as he leaned against the door. Avery thought he should call somebody, the police, or an ambulance. But what would he say? "Bugs came out of my ass and ate a man." He'd be whisked off to a padded room straight away, telling a story like that. Even if he could convince the doctors he wasn't crazy, then what? Well, they'd isolate him, that's what. Place him in some sort of extreme quarantine. There would be tests and biopsies, and all manner of poking and prodding, after what he'd seen his mother go through. Well, no. Just no. Maybe it was over, he thought. Maybe all the bugs were out of him. There had been a good many in the toilet this morning, and quite a lot in the alley. His bowels could only hold so many, couldn't they? Certainly he'd evacuated them all. He'd give it a day, maybe 2, see what happened. Before involving any authorities, no action seemed to be the best course of action. After all, there wasn't any sense of causing a fuss until he knew for sure. Also, Avery was an abject coward. In the meantime, he decided, the most sensible thing to do was to have another glass of elderberry liqueur. There must be just enough left in Mother's bottle to settle his nerves, clear his head. Avery was halfway to the kitchen when the pain doubled him over. There was no build-up, no warning, no inkling of what was to come. His intestines coiled up upon themselves like twisted ropes. The pressure was overwhelming. He stumbled into the bathroom and drew himself to the toilet just as his anus exploded. When he chanced to look in the bowl, it was full of insects. "Oh no, please no," he moaned, and pawed the handle, flushing them away. There was no choice. He had to call an ambulance. As he tried to stand, his guts twisted again. The pain was debilitating. He fell back to the seat. Bugs gushed out of him, filling the bowl. He flushed. It happened again, and again, and again, and again. 3 days later, Mrs. Baumgartner stood in the hallway outside Avery's door with the super and 2 other police officers. "Do you smell that?" she asked. "Like spoiled elderberries. And the toilet, he just kept flushing it over and over. It's all quiet now, but it went on like that for hours. He got a drug lab in there, I bet. Destroying the evidence, he was. You mark my words." The super and the 2 officers rolled their eyes in unison before the super used his master key to allow the officers inside. They had to ask Mrs. Baumgartner to remain in the hall 3 times. She watched every episode of CSI, NCIS, all the Law & Order spinoffs, and Murder, She Wrote at least twice, and couldn't understand why the police wouldn't allow someone with her extensive knowledge to help out. In the bathroom, they found the desiccated corpse of Avery Tibbits, still seated on the toilet, khakis around his ankles. The coroner would eventually rule that his death had been caused by extreme dehydration, although nobody can understand how a man could die of thirst just an arm's length from the bathroom sink. The police had more pressing matters to attend to. The case was closed, and promptly forgotten. Except, of course, by yours truly. So there you have it, boys and girls. Believe it or not, I care not either way. It's strange, though. As much as I do know about poor Avery and his terrible, sad tale, there's something I don't know. What happened to all those bugs he flushed away? Where have they gone? What have they been up to since? As we've already established, most people check the bowl after they go. As for me, I think I'll be checking mine before. Good evening, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. If you guys are looking for a nice hot beverage to enjoy while listening to scary stories, or if it's still snowing out where you guys are, because I keep seeing that everywhere, then might I suggest you check out etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. My wife's tea shop. She has numerous different teas that you can be able to get, as well as Dungeons & Dragons and Creepypasta themed teas. And if you ask for the Mr. Creepypasta dabbing sticker, if you get a Mr. Creepypasta Dark and Stormy Night tea, then you get the special little sticker that I threw together. And of course, I want to give a very, very, very big shout out to all of my followers on Patreon, especially Bloodlace, Peter Bowie, AcidSystem, F, Alan Hyper, Brennan Matthews, Mary Massacre, Janine Hook, Paul Livingston, Seth Joseph Richards, Ashlyn, Deadeye Nick, Azad Hosenbokus, Rick Dance, Bryce Charles, Luminen Walker, Sheri Morgan, Jake Mcnee, Victoria Helton, BDH9294, Melinda S, Phinney, Nathan, Dante Rowe, Jane Rennalls, Ace Band G, Ryan Kellum, Bobby J. Kavanaugh, Barbara Biggs, Bella Bailey, Ninja Grace, Dad Obsessed Trash, Suzanne Grow, Tommy Walters, Tater Chip, Onbu Op Willie, Sarah Gree, Yuri Catslash, Randy, Brad Gustafson, Sean Tristan Markham, B. Lisa Tyser, Jose Rodriguez, Adagio Rose, Peaceful Buddha, Azarine Fox, Freddy Krueger, Ho Gunkchi, Justin Johnson, King Hades F13, Michael Scarborough, James Lowe, Someone You Love, Nina Smith, Rafael Rodriguez, and Chance Burnett. You guys, as always, are the real MVP, and I can't thank you enough for helping me get to where I am now and, generally keeping me alive. So Thank you all so much for supporting on Patreon. Thank you everybody in the description for supporting on Patreon. And thank you everybody out there who's listening and watching somewhere across the many reaches of the internet. Have a good night and sweet dreams.